The sun rose slowly over the quiet village of Langenfeld. Birds sang softly, and the morning mist hung low over the green fields. Farmers were already in the fields, tending to their crops, and children ran along the dirt paths, laughing and chasing each other. Everything seemed peaceful. But this peace was only a fragile mask over a world on the brink of chaos. In the middle of the village lived a young farm boy named Jacob. He was ordinary in every way. His clothes were simple, his hands rough from work, and his eyes held the calm of someone who had spent his life tending animals and plowing fields. People called him quiet, even shy, and he never seemed to stand out. He liked the small, simple things in life, feeding the chickens, helping his father, and walking through the fields at sunrise. But on this morning, Jacob felt a strange tension in the air. Birds were quieter than usual. Dogs barked nervously at the edge of the forest. From far away he could see a column of smoke rising on the horizon. The villagers at first did not notice. They went about their work, thinking it was another small fire somewhere in the woods. Jacob knew better. He ran toward the hill at the edge of the village to see more clearly. There, in the distance, he saw them, German soldiers, marching in perfect formation, tanks rolling behind them, engines loud and frightening. They were organized, ruthless, unstoppable. Jacob had heard stories of their power, of entire villages being taken in a single day. And now they were heading straight for his home. The boy's heart pounded. The villagers were unaware of the danger creeping closer. Mothers tended to their children, old men carried baskets of bread, and farmers worked their fields. No one imagined that the shadow of war was moving steadily toward them. Jacob ran back to the village, warning anyone who would listen. "They are coming. Soldiers. Tanks. Get inside." But many ignored him. Some thought he was exaggerating. Others were too afraid to move. Only a few stopped to look toward the horizon, where the German soldiers marched like a dark storm. The Germans advanced with precision. Their tanks rumbled through the forest paths, crushing everything in their way. Soldiers shouted commands, their voices cold and sharp. Smoke and dust rose into the air as the villagers began to panic. Horses neighed and ran away, and children cried. The once peaceful village was now a place of fear and uncertainty. Jacob ran to his father, who was gathering tools and trying to organize the villagers. "Father, we have to do something. We cannot let them take us," he shouted. His father shook his head. "Jacob, we are just villagers. We are not soldiers. What can we do?" Jacob's mind raced. He was not a soldier. He had no training. But something inside him stirred, a courage he did not know he had. He looked around and saw the burning remains of an old tank at the edge of the village. It had been left behind during a previous skirmish. The metal was blackened, smoke still rising from it, and the fire flickered in the morning light. For a moment, Jacob felt fear. But then a strange thought came to him. What if I can use it? His heart raced as he stared at the burning tank. Could one boy really stop hundreds of soldiers with something old and broken? The idea seemed impossible. Yet, in the face of danger, Jacob knew he could not simply run and hide. He ran toward the tank, ignoring the burning heat, ignoring the smoke that made his eyes sting. The villagers watched in silence, too afraid to act, as Jacob climbed onto the tank. He examined it quickly, thinking of every possible way to use it against the advancing enemy. The fire could scare them, the metal could block their path, and the weapons might still work if he tried. A shiver ran down his spine. He was just a farm boy. No one had ever expected him to do something heroic. And yet, here he was, standing on a burning tank, staring at an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The odds were against him. One boy versus hundreds of trained soldiers. One tank versus an army. But Jacob's determination burned brighter than the fire beneath him. He knew he had to act. "If not me, then who?" he whispered to himself. The moment was tense, silent except for the crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of the German engines. Every second felt like a lifetime. The villagers held their breath, watching. The soldiers drew closer, unaware of the plan forming in the mind of a boy who seemed ordinary to everyone else. Smoke and fire painted the scene with danger and urgency. The question hung in the air like a storm: how could one boy with a burning tank stop hundreds of enemy soldiers? The answer was about to unfold. The German soldiers were closer now. Their tanks rolled with a heavy, menacing rhythm, and their boots crushed the soft earth as they advanced. Smoke from their engines twisted into the sky like dark ribbons, warning of the chaos they carried. The villagers of Langenfeld were frozen in fear. Mothers clutched their children tightly, and farmers dropped their tools, unable to move. Even the bravest men seemed powerless against the unstoppable force approaching. Jacob stood on the burning tank, his hands shaking from fear and the heat. The fire beneath him crackled and hissed, sending sparks into the morning air. But he did not step down. His heart pounded not just with fear but with a strange determination. He could feel the weight of every life in the village pressing down on him. He had no choice. He could not run. He looked at the tank's old guns, charred and rusted, and then at the advancing Germans. A plan began forming in his mind, crude but dangerous. He would use the burning tank to slow them down, to scare them, and maybe, just maybe, he could stop them from entering the village. Every second counted. Every wrong move could cost him his life, and the lives of everyone he loved. The first German tank came into view, a massive machine of steel and destruction. Its cannon swung slowly, aiming at the village, ready to destroy anything in its path. Soldiers ran beside it, shouting orders, moving with precise coordination. Jacob's stomach twisted in fear. One mistake and it would be over. But he took a deep breath and held onto the fire inside him. He grabbed a piece of metal debris from the burning tank and held it like a weapon. Then he shouted with all the force his young voice could muster. "Get back! Leave this village!" His voice cracked, but it carried across the field. The Germans barely noticed, thinking it was the yell of a frightened boy. Jacob ran along the tank, trying to ignite the remaining fuel. Flames burst higher, sending thick smoke into the sky. The fire created a wall of heat and light, and the Germans had to slow down. The first tank stopped, hesitated. Jacob saw the opportunity. He climbed higher onto the tank, pointing toward the enemy. He could see the fear in the soldiers' eyes, the confusion spreading. They had never expected resistance from a single boy. But the danger was far from over. The Germans were experienced soldiers. They quickly regrouped, moving cautiously around the fire. Tanks circled, soldiers advanced with rifles ready, and the roar of engines grew louder. Jacob's heart raced. He was just a boy, and yet he had to face an army. Every step, every movement was a battle between life and death. He thought of the villagers hiding in the houses. Old men, women, children, all depending on him. He couldn't fail. He had to buy them time. Jacob remembered the river nearby and the narrow paths that could trap the tanks. An idea sparked in his mind. If he could lure them into the narrow streets, the Germans' power would be limited. The fire could work as a trap, slowing them down further. Jacob made his move. He ran alongside the tank, waving his arms, shouting, and throwing debris to make the fire seem more dangerous than it was. The Germans, cautious and curious, slowed their advance. The first tank hesitated, then tried to maneuver around the flames. Jacob jumped from the burning metal, landing hard but determined, and ran toward the narrow path leading into the village. The Germans followed, drawn by the apparent movement of a lone target. Inside the village, villagers peered from windows and doorways, hearts pounding. They could see Jacob, small but fearless, facing the approaching soldiers. Each step he took was heroic but also terrifying. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of burning metal, and the sound of distant shouting. It was chaos, but Jacob moved with purpose. He reached the edge of the narrow path and paused. He looked back at the first tank, now stuck between the burning debris and the houses. Soldiers shouted orders, trying to find a way through, but the narrow streets slowed them down. Jacob's plan was working, but he was far from safe. The second wave of German soldiers had noticed him and were advancing from the other side. Panic tried to creep into Jacob's mind, but he pushed it away. Fear was natural, but courage meant action despite fear. He grabbed a piece of metal pipe, swinging it toward the nearest soldiers to distract them. Sparks flew as the pipe hit a metal gate, and the sound made the soldiers flinch. Every small move mattered. Every second bought the villagers more time to hide or escape. Jacob could hear whispers in his mind, "I am just a boy. I am just a boy. I cannot stop them." But then he remembered the fire, the villagers, and the promise he made silently to himself, "I will not let them take my home." That thought burned brighter than the flames. The Germans were close now, but they were confused. One boy, a burning tank, and clever use of terrain had slowed an army. Jacob felt a small surge of hope. But he knew this was only the beginning. The enemy was smart, relentless, and far stronger than him. He had to think faster, act braver, and survive longer if he wanted to protect everyone. The sun climbed higher, the fire crackled, and Jacob stood ready. One boy, a burning tank, and an unstoppable enemy. The battle was only beginning. The village's fate rested on his shoulders. Every second counted, every move mattered, and the suspense grew. Could one farm boy really face an entire army? Jacob's heart pounded like a drum as he stood on the burning tank, sweat mixing with soot on his face. The fire beneath him hissed and spat sparks, licking the air with heat. He could hear the German soldiers shouting orders, their voices sharp and harsh as they tried to figure out the best way to approach. Tanks rumbled forward, slow but powerful, crushing small trees and fences in their path. Jacob was alone. One boy, a burning tank, and an army. He looked around quickly. The first tank had stopped at the edge of the narrow path, confused by the flames. Jacob's mind raced. Every second he waited gave the enemy more time to adjust, but every second he moved carefully could save the village. He took a deep breath, feeling the heat on his back, and stepped forward. The boy grabbed an old lever inside the tank, the one that still had some connection to the engine. It was dangerous, he didn't know if it would explode, but he had to try. Sparks flew as he pulled it, and suddenly the tank roared to life, its gun swiveling toward the advancing Germans. Jacob ducked behind the hatch as a shell fired from the cannon, crashing into the dirt road in front of the enemy. Smoke and dust exploded into the air. The German soldiers shouted in shock. The first strike worked. The soldiers hesitated, unsure what kind of weapon they were facing. One tank had been destroyed in front of their eyes, and the boy in the burning tank seemed fearless. Jacob's confidence grew. He could see it in the eyes of the soldiers. They were confused, afraid, and angry all at once. They had never expected resistance from a single village boy. Jacob took a moment to breathe, then quickly realized the battle was far from over. More German soldiers were moving up behind the first wave. He had to act fast. He used the fire around the tank as a weapon. Flames licked out toward the narrow path, blocking the soldiers and forcing them to stop. The heat was intense, but Jacob moved carefully, using every bit of cover the tank could provide. The boy's first real strike had bought him some time, but the Germans were smart. They tried to surround the tank, moving through the side streets of the village. Jacob's eyes darted from one path to another. He had to think quickly. He saw an abandoned cart filled with hay and wood near the road. He pushed it into the flames, creating a larger barrier that the soldiers could not pass easily. Smoke filled the air, and the fire seemed to grow taller with every second. Jacob could hear the sound of German rifles and shouting. Soldiers were trying to get closer, but the burning tank and fire made them pause. The boy realized he had an advantage: confusion. They did not expect a boy standing on a damaged tank to be this dangerous. Every small act, throwing debris, swinging metal bars, igniting the fire, made the Germans second-guess themselves. Suddenly, a German officer shouted orders, pointing toward the tank. "Focus fire. Take him down." Soldiers opened fire, bullets hitting the tank with loud clangs. Jacob ducked low, sparks flying around him. The heat was unbearable, but he ignored the pain. He could not stop now. Every moment he hesitated, the village was in danger. Jacob decided to make his next move bold and risky. He opened the tank's hatch and leaned out slightly, waving his arms and shouting. His voice was small but loud enough to carry over the battlefield. He shouted directions to himself, imagining how he could lead the Germans into traps. The enemy paused, confused. A single boy was acting like a commander. The audacity of it stunned them. The fire and the tank's first cannon shot had created chaos. German soldiers were scattered, tanks slowed down, and confusion spread. Jacob seized the moment. He aimed the tank's cannon at another advancing enemy vehicle and fired. A loud explosion echoed through the village. Smoke, dirt, and fire filled the air. The second tank was damaged, its crew scrambling inside. Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline. His plan was working. But he knew it would not last long. The Germans would regroup and he was running out of time. His arms ached from gripping the levers, his clothes were soaked in sweat and soot, and the fire beneath him was getting hotter. Yet Jacob's determination only grew stronger. This was not just about bravery, it was survival. He had to stop them no matter the cost. Jacob climbed higher on the tank, using every ounce of strength to prepare another shot. His eyes scanned the field. Soldiers were moving closer, trying to flank him, but the fire kept them at bay. The first strike had not only caused damage, it had sent a message. One boy, clever and fearless, could disrupt an entire army. The villagers watched in stunned silence, peeking through windows and doorways. They had never seen courage like this. One small boy, fighting against impossible odds, had become the village's shield. The suspense hung thick in the air. Everyone knew this battle was far from over, but for the first time, hope flickered like the fire surrounding Jacob. Jacob took another deep breath, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and readied himself. He knew the enemy would not hesitate to strike back harder. But he also knew he had discovered something incredible. Even the smallest, most ordinary person could change the course of a battle with courage, intelligence, and daring. The first strike was only the beginning. Jacob's fight against the German army had truly begun, and the world was about to witness the bravery of a single farm boy who refused to surrender. The morning sun had climbed higher, but the village of Langenfeld was far from bright. Smoke twisted into the sky from the burning tank, and the smell of fire mixed with the dust of crushed earth. Jacob's first strike had slowed the German advance, but it had not stopped them. In fact, it had angered them. The enemy was regrouping, stronger, smarter, and determined to crush the boy who dared challenge them. Jacob crouched low on the burning tank, his hands blistered and his clothes blackened by smoke and soot. He could hear the heavy rumble of approaching tanks and the sharp clatter of boots on the cobblestone streets. German officers shouted orders, pointing and gesturing, trying to coordinate their troops. Every second, more soldiers moved into position, surrounding the village from all sides. The boy's heart pounded, but he refused to show fear. He had faced a small wave of the enemy before and survived, but now the real storm was coming. One tank moved to the right, another to the left, while infantry advanced through the village. Jacob could feel the tension in the air. It was thick and heavy like the smoke around him. Every second counted, every movement could be fatal. He looked at the burning tank beneath him. It was old and damaged, a relic of another battle, but it was all he had. The fire crackled, sparks flying, and heat licked his skin. Jacob took a deep breath and reminded himself, "I can do this. I have to." Suddenly, German soldiers fired their rifles at the tank. Bullets ricocheted off the metal with loud clangs. Jacob ducked low, feeling sparks dance around him. One bullet pierced a nearby metal panel, sending a shower of tiny flames into the air. He realized quickly that staying in one place was dangerous. The Germans were not confused anymore, they had learned. Jacob climbed down slightly, using the sides of the tank for cover, and scanned the battlefield. Soldiers were moving cautiously now, but their numbers overwhelmed him. The first wave of fear returned, whispering in his mind, "I am just a boy. I cannot win." But Jacob pushed it away. Fear was natural, courage was action. And he had a plan. He remembered the narrow streets of the village. If he could lure the tanks and soldiers into those confined spaces, the enemy's power would be limited. He grabbed a metal pipe and threw it across the street, creating a loud clatter that caught the soldiers' attention. They paused, looking toward the sound. Jacob used the distraction to ignite another pile of debris, sending flames twisting into the air. The Germans hesitated, unsure of the boy's intentions. The burning tank, the fire, and the clever placement of obstacles had created confusion. But Jacob knew this was only temporary. The enemy was relentless, and soon they would realize the trick. He had to act faster. From behind a wall, a tank moved closer, aiming its cannon at the burning vehicle. Jacob felt a rush of panic, but he forced himself to think. He remembered an old ditch near the village edge. If he could lead the tank toward it, it might get stuck, giving him a chance to strike again. Jacob shouted, waving his arms, running toward the ditch and drawing the enemy's attention. The German tank followed cautiously. Soldiers fired, but the flames and debris slowed them down. Jacob's heart raced as he led them, carefully balancing between danger and opportunity. He could see the tank's treads getting close to the ditch's edge. One wrong step and it could crush him, but Jacob pressed forward. Just as he reached the ditch, a cannon blast hit the side of the burning tank. Sparks flew, metal twisted, and Jacob stumbled, almost falling into the fire. He gritted his teeth, clutching the edge of the hatch for support. The heat was unbearable, the smoke thick, and the danger closer than ever. He felt the first real sting of fear. One wrong move and it would be over. But Jacob did not give up. He grabbed a lever and pulled it with all his strength, causing the tank's remaining gun to fire again. A shell hit the advancing German tank, exploding near its treads. Dust, smoke, and fire erupted, slowing the enemy further. Jacob's plan was working, but he knew the battle was far from over. The Germans were furious now. They regrouped, bringing in more tanks and soldiers, surrounding the boy from multiple sides. Jacob's eyes darted from left to right, calculating every move. He knew he could not fight them all head-on. His only chance was to keep moving, to use the terrain, and to make them hesitate at every turn. Inside the village, villagers watched in tense silence. They had never seen such courage, never imagined a single boy could stand against an entire army. Mothers whispered prayers, children clung to their fathers, and old men held their breath. Every explosion, every flash of fire, made their hearts pound. Jacob was their shield. The boy climbed higher on the burning tank, ignoring the heat, the smoke, and the bullets. His mind raced, thinking of the next move. He had slowed the Germans, caused damage, and bought time for the village. But he knew this was just the beginning. The enemy would not stop and neither could he. The Germans continued to advance, relentless and deadly. Jacob's courage, cleverness, and determination were the only things standing between them and the village. Every second was a test of his strength, every moment a battle between life and death. The suspense was unbearable. Could one boy, a burning tank, and courage alone hold back an unstoppable army? The answer was still unknown. But Jacob would not give up. He would fight, survive, and protect his village no matter the cost. The battle raged on, and the legend of the farm boy who dared face an army was only beginning to unfold. Jacob stood on the burning tank, sweat and soot covering his face, his clothes torn and scorched from the flames. The heat was almost unbearable and the smoke made it hard to breathe, but he could not stop. He had to think, act, and survive. The German soldiers were no longer hesitant. They had regrouped, bringing more tanks and infantry, determined to crush the boy who had defied them. The village lay behind him, quiet but tense. Windows were shut, doors bolted, and villagers huddled inside, praying silently. Jacob knew that if he failed, the entire village would be lost. He looked around, scanning the narrow streets, the open fields, and the small alleys that wove through the village. Suddenly, an idea sparked in his mind. It was risky, dangerous, and perhaps impossible, but it was his only chance. Jacob would use the village itself as a trap. The narrow streets, hidden ditches, and old fences could be his weapons. If he could lure the Germans into the confined paths, the tanks would lose their advantage, soldiers would become vulnerable, and the fire could spread strategically to slow them even further. The plan was simple in theory, but executing it would require courage, speed, and perfect timing. He ran down from the burning tank, carefully avoiding the flames and debris. Every step was dangerous, every second could be his last. Jacob grabbed pieces of wood, metal, and barrels of leftover fuel from nearby sheds. He began placing them strategically along the narrow streets, creating obstacles, barricades, and fire traps. The German tanks had power, but they could not maneuver easily through tight paths. The boy had to use that to his advantage. Jacob's heart pounded as he worked. Bullets whizzed past and distant explosions shook the ground. He moved quickly, hiding behind walls and piles of rubble, setting small fires along the route. Smoke curled into the sky, thick and black, masking his movements. He was careful to stay out of sight, moving like a shadow through the village, leaving traps and obstacles for the advancing enemy. Finally, he reached the main street. He glanced back at the burning tank, now partially destroyed but still blocking one side of the village. It had done its job, it had slowed the Germans and caused chaos. Jacob knew that the first wave of soldiers would focus on it, giving him precious minutes to finish setting his plan in motion. He positioned the final barrels of fuel near a narrow corner where the German soldiers would have to pass. With a spark from a piece of metal, he ignited them. Flames leapt high, blocking the way forward. The German tanks were forced to stop, their engines roaring in frustration. Infantry soldiers were slowed, confused, and exposed. Jacob had turned the village into a deadly maze, and the Germans were trapped inside. The enemy commander shouted orders, his voice sharp and commanding. Move forward. Break through. But every attempt to advance ended in frustration. Tanks were stuck, streets were blocked, and fire created chaos. Jacob watched from a hidden rooftop, his small figure barely visible through smoke and debris. He could see the fear in the soldiers' eyes now. They had underestimated him and now they were paying the price. Jacob's plan worked, but he knew he could not relax. The Germans would not give up easily. They tried to regroup, sending small squads to flank the village, but the narrow streets and barricades slowed them down. Soldiers tripped, tanks got stuck, and confusion spread like wildfire. Every move Jacob had predicted was happening exactly as he had imagined. He had turned fear into a weapon, fire into strategy, and courage into power. Inside the village, the villagers watched in awe. They had never seen such cleverness or bravery. One small boy, using the village in a burning tank, had turned the impossible into reality. Mothers whispered prayers of gratitude, children clutched their parents tightly, and old men nodded in silent admiration. Jacob was no longer just a farm boy, he was a force, a symbol of courage and intelligence. But Jacob did not have time to celebrate. The Germans were still dangerous, still alive, and still trying to find a way through. The fire, smoke, and traps had slowed them, but they were persistent. Jacob needed one final move to solidify his advantage. He climbed onto the roof of a nearby building, giving him a better view of the village. From there he could see the enemy tanks, soldiers, and the chaos he had created. He took a deep breath and prepared to fire the tank's remaining cannon at the most dangerous target. the lead tank trying to break through the corner. Sparks flew as he aimed, and with one loud roar the shell hit its mark. The tank shuddered, smoke rising from its engine, and the soldiers panicked. Jacob had struck fear into the heart of the enemy. The plan was working and victory was within reach. For a moment, Jacob allowed himself to feel pride. He had taken what seemed like a hopeless situation and turned it into a battlefield advantage. One boy, using fire, cleverness, and courage, had stopped an entire army. But he knew the battle was not over. The Germans were relentless and his courage would be tested again. As he glanced down at the village, Jacob realized something important. His plan had done more than slow the enemy, it had inspired the villagers. They were no longer mere spectators. Quietly, behind doors and windows, they were preparing to help, to fight back if needed. Jacob had not only trapped the Germans, he had given hope to his people. The suspense hung thick in the air. The fire roared, the tanks rumbled, and Jacob stood ready. One clever plan, executed perfectly, had changed the course of the battle. But the enemy was still dangerous, and the next move could decide everything. The farm boy had shown his courage, his intelligence, and his daring. Now the stage was set for the next phase of the battle, the turning point that could finally push the Germans back. Jacob had become more than a boy, he had become a legend in the making. The village of Langenfeld was shrouded in smoke and fire. Flames from the burning tank and scattered debris twisted into the sky, painting the morning in orange and black. Jacob's small frame moved quickly among the obstacles he had set, sweat and soot streaking his face. His arms ached, his clothes were scorched, and the heat from the fire burned his skin, but he could not stop. The German army was relentless. Tanks rumbled closer, firing at the barricades. Soldiers shouted, trying to coordinate a breakthrough. Jacob ducked behind a broken wall as bullets whizzed past, hitting wood and metal with loud clangs. He could hear the shouts of terrified villagers, and the cries of animals trapped in the chaos. Every second was a test of his courage. Every decision could save lives, or cost them. Jacob knew he had slowed the Germans, but now the real danger arrived. A heavy tank, bigger and stronger than the rest, moved through the village, smashing debris in its path. Jacob's traps had slowed the soldiers, but this machine threatened to crush everything in its way. His heart raced. One wrong move and the village would be lost. He climbed onto a rooftop for a better view. From there, he could see the soldiers moving through the narrow streets, tanks advancing, and the chaos he had created. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his pounding heart. Jacob knew he had one chance to turn the tide, one chance to make his plan work completely. Nearby, villagers were beginning to notice what he was doing. Mothers and fathers peeked from windows, children held close to their chests. Some of the older men quietly grabbed farming tools, ready to help if needed. Jacob's courage had sparked something in them. They were no longer just hiding. They were beginning to fight, to resist, to survive. Jacob climbed down carefully from the roof and sprinted toward the burning tank. The lead German tank was close now, its cannon ready. Jacob ducked behind the metal hull, using it as cover. He could see the enemy soldiers coordinating, trying to avoid the fires and obstacles he had set. They were still strong, still deadly, but he had made them hesitate. Hesitation could be enough. He reached a pile of barrels filled with fuel that he had prepared earlier. His hands shook as he grabbed a torch, lighting the barrels in sequence. Flames erupted along the path the German tanks were taking. Smoke rose thickly into the air, obscuring vision and slowing the enemy. The boy had created a wall of fire, and the soldiers could do nothing but stop and assess. But then disaster nearly struck. One of the German tanks fired a shell directly at Jacob's position. The explosion sent dirt, debris, and flames everywhere. Jacob was thrown to the ground, ears ringing, vision blurred. Pain shot through his arm and leg, but he forced himself to move. He could not give up now, not when victory was so close. With grit and determination, Jacob climbed to his feet. He had survived the first attack, and now he saw the moment he had been waiting for. The German soldiers were trapped by the fire, their tanks stuck in narrow streets, and the villagers had begun to quietly rise against them, using pitchforks, stones, and whatever tools they could find. Jacob realized this was his chance to inspire a true counterattack. He ran through the streets, shouting orders as loudly as he could. "Here. Throw it there. Block the path." His small voice carried through the chaos, giving the villagers confidence. One by one they began to move, coordinated not by training but by courage, by the example of a boy who had refused to surrender. Jacob's fear became focus, and his focus became leadership. The heavy tank roared, trying to push through, but it was slowed by the fires and barricades. Jacob aimed the tank's remaining cannon and fired a shell at its treads. Sparks flew, metal twisted, and smoke rose from the tank's engine. The soldiers panicked, realizing their advantage had been lost. One boy, a burning tank and clever use of the village had turned the tide. The villagers, emboldened by Jacob's courage, joined the fight openly. Farmers wielded pitchforks, old men hurled stones, and even children helped by throwing burning debris at advancing soldiers. Jacob's boldness had sparked resistance where fear had ruled before. The Germans, confused and frightened, began to retreat slightly, unsure how to advance in the chaos. Jacob paused for a moment, breathing heavily. He looked at the village, the streets filled with smoke, the villagers fighting bravely, the enemy struggling to regroup. For the first time, hope seemed possible. He realized that courage was contagious. His actions had inspired others, and together they could challenge even the strongest army. But the battle was not over. Tanks still rumbled forward and soldiers were still deadly. Jacob's body ached and the fire was still dangerous beneath him. He knew that one wrong move could end everything. Yet, with every fiber of his being, he refused to stop. He had discovered something important. Determination, courage, and clever thinking could turn the impossible into the possible. The turning point had arrived. Jacob's courage had slowed the Germans, inspired the villagers, and disrupted the enemy's strategy. For the first time, the tide of battle seemed to favor the boy and his people. Flames roared, smoke twisted into the sky, and the German soldiers hesitated, unsure how to advance. Jacob had done the impossible. Standing on the burning tank, surrounded by chaos and fire, Jacob looked out across the village. One boy, ordinary and quiet, had faced an unstoppable army. He had been wounded, tested, and pushed to his limits, but he had survived. And now, with the villagers rising alongside him, the impossible seemed possible. The suspense was at its peak. Could Jacob, with the help of the inspired villagers, finally push back the German army? The battle was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. Jacob had become more than a boy. He had become a symbol of hope, courage, and defiance in the face of impossible odds. The legend of the farm boy and his burning tank was not yet finished. The next phase of the battle would decide everything, and Jacob was ready. The sun was high now, burning down on the village of Langenfeld, but the air was thick with smoke. Flames still flickered from the burning tank, debris littered the streets, and the smell of scorched metal and earth filled every corner. Jacob's arms were sore, his clothes torn, and his face streaked with sweat and soot, but he refused to stop. The German army had been slowed, confused, and frustrated, but they were still alive. The final push was coming, and Jacob knew that this moment would decide everything. He stood atop the burning tank, the heat intense beneath his feet, and surveyed the battlefield. Tanks were stuck in the narrow streets, smoke and fire blocking their path, and soldiers were scattered, uncertain how to proceed. The villagers, emboldened by Jacob's courage, had taken up arms. They threw stones, used pitchforks, and set fire to barricades, striking at the enemy whenever they could. Jacob realized the impossible was within reach. One boy in a village could fight back an entire army. The German commander, furious and desperate, shouted orders. Tanks tried to push forward, soldiers tried to regroup, but the confusion and fear had taken hold. Jacob's mind raced. He had one chance to end this. If he could create one final trap, strike the lead tanks, and inspire the villagers to fully attack, the Germans would have no choice but to retreat. Jacob climbed down from the tank and ran to the edge of the narrow street, dodging debris and fire. He grabbed a long metal rod and used it to ignite the remaining fuel barrels, sending flames roaring up into the sky. Sparks flew, smoke swirled, and the lead German tank was forced to halt. The other tanks, trapped behind it in the narrow streets, ground to a stop. Jacob's plan was working perfectly. From hidden corners, villagers joined in. Farmers wielded scythes and axes, old men hurled stones, and even children helped by throwing burning debris at the enemy. Jacob moved from street to street, shouting directions and encouragement. His small voice carried through the chaos. Now! Push them back. Do not let them through. The Germans were caught in a maze of fire, obstacles, and chaos. Their tanks were stalled, soldiers exposed, and morale was breaking. Jacob fired the tank's remaining cannon one last time, hitting a lead vehicle and causing an explosion that shook the village. Smoke, fire, and dust filled the air. Soldiers stumbled, tanks faltered, and confusion spread like wildfire. Jacob had turned the battlefield into his advantage. The final push began. Jacob ran toward the trapped German soldiers, leading the villagers in a coordinated attack. They moved like a wave, striking wherever they could, surprising the enemy with their bravery. Soldiers tried to fight back, but the chaos, flames, and relentless courage of the boy and villagers were too much. Jacob's heart pounded as he dodged debris, helped a trapped villager, and kept moving forward. One by one, the German soldiers began to retreat. Tanks that had once seemed unstoppable were now stuck or destroyed. The commander realized his forces were overmatched, not in skill but in courage and determination. Jacob, a farm boy no one had taken seriously, had changed the course of the battle. The army that had seemed invincible now scrambled to escape the burning streets of Langenfeld. As the Germans finally began to withdraw, Jacob stood atop the burning tank, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the village. The streets were filled with smoke, debris, and the tired, frightened but victorious villagers. Mothers and fathers rushed to hug their children, old men wiped tears from their eyes, and villagers cheered softly for the boy who had saved them all. Jacob allowed himself a small smile. He had done it. Against all odds he had protected his home. The village was safe, but the cost was clear. The tank was destroyed, streets were damaged, and the air still smelled of smoke and fire. Jacob walked through the streets, checking on the villagers, helping those in need, and quietly feeling the weight of what he had achieved. He had faced fear, pain, and danger, and had come out victorious. But Jacob also knew something important. This victory was not just his, it was the courage of an entire village, inspired by the bravery of one ordinary boy. It was proof that even the smallest person with courage, cleverness, and determination could stand against overwhelming odds. The legend of Jacob, the farm boy with the burning tank, would live in the hearts of the villagers forever. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the village. Smoke still rose from the final flames, but the battle was over. Jacob stood quietly, looking out at the horizon, exhausted but proud. He had faced an unstoppable enemy, used fire and cleverness to trap and confuse them, and inspired his people to fight. He had turned fear into courage, weakness into strength, and an ordinary day into a story of heroism. The villagers gathered around him, offering quiet thanks, gentle smiles, and relieved embraces. Jacob, still young, still quiet, realized that he had grown in ways he never imagined. He had faced the impossible, survived, and protected everything he loved. The story of one farm boy, a burning tank, and 250 enemy soldiers would be told for generations. A story of bravery, cleverness, and the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. As night fell, the village was quiet again, but this time it was a peaceful quiet, filled with relief and admiration. Jacob looked at the stars above, thinking of the day that had changed everything. One boy, a burning tank, and a village full of courage had faced an army, and had won. The impossible had become possible. And so, the legend of Jacob, the farm boy who stopped 250 German soldiers, was born.